to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itron, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Well, I don't know about you, Ro, but I definitely needed some caffeine today talking about the budget after enduring 3 hours of Governor Newsom's budget press conference.
I know, Tim, you had the unenviable task of listening to that. Was it 3 hours?
Just him alone was 3 hours.
So, does it take this long? Is this a practice? And how did you even manage to not fall asleep, you and the journalists and all the people who need to listen to these things?
Well, I've seen on Twitter in recent years, since Newsom has been governor, and this is definitely his style. Every year is, a multi-hour budget presentation, that they prepare themselves. They have little snacks they bring with them. I think they limit how much liquid they drink.
Lots of Starbucks.
Yes. Just on the pure style of it, thinking back, the budget is one of the biggest events of the year for the governor. All eyes are on the governor from everyone who has some sort of interest in the budget, and certainly media from across the state. And I remember when I worked in the Schwarzenegger administration, we would always write the budget speech. And January is a big time, right? Usually there's the state of the state. Right afterwards, there's the budget. That's changed in recent years. But, the governor's budget press conference, the governor might speak for 15 or 20 minutes, if that, and then take reporter questions and then turn it over to the director of finance. The whole budget press conference might have been an hour, if that. And so that this guy is going on for 3 hours, and it seems like he just has a need to tell you that he is the smartest man in Sacramento. He knows in incredible detail every bit of the budget, and he's going to tell you all about it. And gosh, I just don't know that serves the public well. If I were his staff, I think I'd be more concerned. Governor, should you really be putting your energy into all of this? Are you focusing your energy on the number of paper clips we buy rather than the bigger picture?
I know, Tim, and I think it was the same for Pete Wilson when I worked for him when he was governor. He gave the big picture message and then turned it over to the budget director or even the heads of the various agencies and the budget of that department. So I think things get lost. He really should have a communications director leading him on this, that he needs to talk about the big picture message, top 3 things that he wants to accomplish this year and the spending priorities for the year, rather than get into the weeds about this, paper clips and so forth, which just mucks it up. And I didn't listen to the speech. So I went to option 2, which you were nice enough to send me the quote summary. I thought, oh, well, Tim sent me the summary. I'm going to read the summary. And it was 400 pages long. So then I went to option 3 and read what the journalists from Politico and Cal Matters and the Sacramento Bee. But when I read all the big budget priorities, and I always ask you the same flabbergasted question here is, Tim, can they really pass all this? And, can they get away with it? And you always say, yeah, probably, Rowena.
Yep, they sure will. I mean, of course, whatever the budget is, however popular the governor is, whatever their political advantage or disadvantage in the legislature, governor carries a lot of weight in what the final budget will be. And usually the governor wins in any budget fight, historically and in recent years. But the governor's budget announcement, it kicks off kind of the silly budget season. So you're going to see now all the interest groups are weighing in, and everybody who has their hand out or wants something out of the budget, they're rattling their cages and they have their bullhorns and they're saying, we need this isn't enough, we need more. It's stunning to think that anybody could say we need more, with the magnitude of the spending proposals that Governor Newsom put out. But it's all a bit of a budget theater now. The legislature will start to hold hearings on the plan and, various provisions. But really, the budget gets serious in May, when they call it the May revise, is put out in the middle of the May. That really kind of kicks off the more serious budget discussions. And then really the final budget, as we saw last year, is really much negotiated behind closed doors between the speaker, the pro tem, and the governor. And put before us, the lawmakers and the public, at the last minute before the vote. So, I don't know that I would get too hot and bothered by, what he proposed yesterday, because whatever it is, it's going to change significantly between now and May and June.
Well, the total figure is now 286 billion, with an estimated 45 billion in surplus. And that's intriguing because there's talk about the Gan limit going to be at play in May when we hear the final numbers. So the question is, how much, or actually how little, taxpayers will receive if the Gan limit kicks in.
One point that I saw when I was going through the budget and listening, and a friend of mine sent this chart to me from the 400-page budget summary. She actually went through it. There's a chart kind of year by year of California's tax revenue. And one of the main criticisms is we have these boom-bust budget cycles in good times and bad because we're over-reliant on the wealthy and capital gains tax revenue. And the chart here says that California, it's projected in the 2022-2023 budget year that nearly 66% of our tax revenue is going to come from personal income taxes. That's staggering to me. And what it really shows me is we have all these, grandiose plans to spend a record amount, but as soon as we even have a sneeze of a recession, which, with all the issues of inflation and what the Federal Reserve might do, we could be moving toward a recession this year. What a budget mess we're going to face almost overnight.
That's right. And I remember the rainy day fund, wasn't it just wiped out immediately in the last recession, just instantly?
Well, I believe the governor proposed about $20 billion for the rainy day funds, and there are limits of how much you can put in it. So we're about at the max, but that shows you that, yes, we have the money socked away, but it'll be gone in an instant. Don't count on the rainy day fund to prevent painful cuts when we're that over-reliant on capital gains taxes.
And, I did see some worthy causes in the budget: fighting homelessness, trying to mitigate the wildfires, more funding to stop the rampant crime across the state. But we want to see accountability, and that taxpayers want to be sure that, these billions of dollars are being effectively spent.
That's exactly right. The devil is always in the details. And thankfully, we have three great folks here with us today to give us some of the details and their perspective on what the governor proposed.
That's right. We've got our all-star budget hawks on board. First up is going to be Weingarten, a PRI senior fellow in business and economics. And then we have senior director of education, Lance Izumi. And then last but not least, Carrie Jackson, PRI's fellow in our Center for California Reform, follows California issues. So we're going to start off with Wayne. Wayne's most recent work is California Migrating, which he co-authored with Kerry Jackson. It's a study on the causes and the impact of Californians migrating out of the state.
And Wayne, has written and studied extensively California's unfunded pension obligation issues, which are a growing crisis that we're going to have to face up to someday. And he also has written and studied extensively about government spending and what is the ideal level of spending to promote economic growth in his Beyond the New Normal series. So when it comes to talking about spending and debt, Wayne is the guy.
So thanks for joining us today, Wayne.
Well, always great to be here.
So Governor Newsom has proposed $286 billion for his state budget, which projects a $45 billion budget surplus. These figures are astronomical, even coming off a record budget year in 2021 and 22. Wayne, are the governor's spending priorities sustainable? And with questions about inflation and the health of the U.S. economy, could our massive state budget surplus soon come tumbling down like a house of cards should we have a recession?
The budget's absolutely not sustainable. I mean, come on, billions more for high-speed rail. I mean, that boondoggle has been wasting money for years and years, and now we're going to throw more billions at it. I mean, turning the government into an insulin manufacturer. I mean, it's such a soft-headed idea because it doesn't address the problem and it commits more resources towards it. And that's one of the troubling kind of features to his budget, is that he is focusing on increasing spending at a time when revenues are coming in. And this is the destructive spending pattern that we've been doing in California. Going back to the 1960s, we've been doing kind of this spending pattern, and the results are as predictable as they are destructive. I mean, I guess to put the problem using an analogy, imagine, you have income earners for a family and they get bonuses twice a year, and you set your monthly kind of spending based on kind of that surge of income for the family when you get that bonus. I mean, obviously, that's not sustainable over time, but because of how steeply progressive California's tax system is, that's the trap that Governor Newsom is falling in again. I mean, you're talking about almost 66% of kind of the tax revenue comes from personal income tax. And most of that's coming from the upper income payers. They did very well. I mean, last year, the S&P 500 is up almost 30%, NASDAQ's over 20%. So you have all of these capital gains. And remember, California, we tax capital gains as regular income. So you have this surge in income, right? And that's what we're so happily spending. That's where the $46 billion surplus comes from. We have all this money. We can do all of these things. But guess what? The revenue will slow down. The economy will, go into recession. The, stock market will not go up every year. And those incomes are going to dry up. And we're going to be stuck with all of these new programs that we won't be able to afford. And that inevitable budget crisis, kind of the second half to this pattern, will reassert itself. And I guess how you put it, Ro, right? The house of cards are going to fall.
So the governor, surprisingly, spoke at length about his plans. Well, he spoke at length about a lot of things, but he spoke at length about his plans to pay down debt and make progress in addressing the state's unfunded public employee pension obligations. So what do you think of the governor's proposals? Are they a step in the right direction, or are they really more window dressing?
I guess symbolically, right, they are a step in the right direction in that, we should be using our rainy day fund to work through that boom and bust cycle I just talked about. We're not doing that, so that's a negative. We're just kind of putting a little extra money in that will to somewhat help alleviate the drier years, but not enough. We're not doing enough to deal with paying down debt, to deal with the employee pension public pension publication problem. And that really needs structural reform. So, from a perspective of, addressing these really troubling long-term trends, what's being done is completely inadequate. And that's disappointing. The fact that it's even being talked about, I mean, I guess that you could say is a positive in that we need to get much more of the conversation focusing on how do we deal with our long-term financial structural problems? How do we pay down the debt? How do we stop wasting money? And so how do we use the rainy day fund to actually more effectively budget over time? Because we don't do that well. But having a conversation, I think that's a nice thing that we're even talking about this. The problem is we're talking about these fiscally responsible ideas, which is being overshadowed by becoming an insulin manufacturer, wasting more money on high-speed rail, on creating new entitlements that we won't be able to afford. And that's where the negative really comes from.
Lastly, Wayne, one of the biggest issues that lawmakers and the governor will have to address this year is the Gan Limit. The state has taken in so much revenue in recent years that the Constitution requires some of it to be invested in infrastructure and education, and some of the surplus has to go back to the taxpayers. So what did the governor say about how he is planning to tackle the Gan Limit? And if you take an honest look at our revenue picture, what should we be doing? Shouldn't taxpayers be getting a much bigger piece of the surplus?
From the spirit of the Gan Limit, if we look at it from that perspective, absolutely, right? Taxpayers should be getting a much bigger piece of the surplus. And in fact, the surplus, the amount of spending should be significantly less because over time, the Gan Limit has been gutted. And that's real. It's a real tragedy. It really has sapped the vitality from California. It's many of our problems can be brought back to the idea that we haven't kept spending under control, and the Gan Limit has been, undermined. The spirit of it has been undermined, and so, in terms of calculating it from an accounting perspective, right? That's what they're doing is correct. When you look at it from what was the purpose of the Gan Limit, that's been completely undermined, and we're paying the price for it in terms of all these fiscal problems that we're having. And when you hear the governor talk about the Gan Limit, it's very much it's almost begrudging that I guess we'll let the taxpayers have a little bit of the money that they shouldn't have paid to us back. And it's so again, it's completely a violation of that of the spirit. And so that that in itself is troubling, and I think that needs to be part of the conversation is trying to understand, where should spending be if we had listened and obeyed the spirit of the Gan Limit? How much of a better position would we be in today compared to where we are? I think that's a very important conversation that we should be having. And it is a positive that the Gan Limit has some bite. It has some limit to it. It should be much lower than it is. But the fact that someone is going back to the taxpayer and that there is those considerations, I think we could think of that as a mild positive. But in the grand scheme of things, it's very disappointed that Gan Limit isn't much more binding than it currently is, and allows for all of this wasteful spending that the governor is proposing. And terrifyingly, he's proposing it and acting as if he's being fiscally responsible when it's the exact opposite.
So next, we're going to look at the biggest area of the budget, and that's, of course, education. And with us to break down the governor's education budget proposals is Lance Izumi, who our listeners are very familiar with as the Senior Director of PRI Center for Education. So, Lance, education spending, of course, is always a big priority for whoever the governor of California is, and Governor Newsom is certainly no exception. So what are some of your thoughts on the governor's key education spending proposals in his budget plan?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to look at the big picture. How much money is the governor spending? And so right now, that Prop 98 spending, which is usually kind of one of the measurements of state funding for education, is going to be, under the governor's proposal, about $102 billion. Now, for comparison, you go back 10 years and you see that the state spent $58 billion just 10 years ago. And now you're talking about, something getting close to doubling that. And now if you add on the amount of money that comes in from other sources like federal spending here in California, that $102 billion that the governor's proposing goes up to $119 billion. And then if you look at the number of students we have in California and divide that into that amount, you get about $20,000 per student that we're going to be spending here in California with revenue from all sources. And so that's a record amount. And so that's a huge amount of money that we're spending. And the question for Californians when they see figures like that is whether we're going to be getting bang for our buck, because, that money has to be spent on something. And what are those somethings that money is going to be spent on? And is that really going to end up improving the learning for our kids, improving their achievement and their academic performance? And unfortunately, I think that if you go down a little bit more into the weeds, into the details of where that money is going to be spent, I don't think Californians can have a lot of confidence that that money is going to produce that bang that we all want from all of those tax dollars. And I'll give you an example. So the governor is proposing $500 million for hiring of more literacy coaches and reading specialists. Now, that sounds good, especially given the fact that California has done very poorly in terms of its reading scores for many, many years. I mean, right before the pandemic, California's performance on the 8th grade national reading exam was abysmal. 82% of low-income students here in California failed to score at the proficient level on that national reading examination amongst 8th graders. And so now you think that adding a bunch of reading coaches and reading specialists, literacy coaches would have helped that. But the question is, what are they going to be teaching? Now, if they're just teaching more of the same, you're not going to get any difference in terms of the level of performance by these kids. And so California, in many of the districts, is using something called balanced literacy as a reading curriculum and a teaching method. And unfortunately, that method has proven to be a failure in many other areas. I mean, not just here in California, but let's say in New York City, for example, where the new New York schools chancellor, a guy named David Banks, is come out, just flatly and said that the balanced literacy program in New York City has been a failure, and he's going to scrap it and put in a phonics-focused instructional program because balanced literacy has failed to improve the performance, especially of Black and brown kids. And so if we in California are going to be using this program called balanced literacy, which has proven to be a failure not just here in California, obviously, with our test scores, but all around the country, and yet we're going to be adding more reading and literacy coaches that are just going to be using that same curriculum, then we're not going to be can't expect to have any better results because it's just going to be a layer of more of the same on top of failure.
So since former Governor Brown was in office, the local control funding formula has usually dominated the discussion when we're talking about the education budget each year. So what is the local control funding formula, and what has Governor Newsom proposed in that area?
Well, first of all, what the governor is proposing is to increase the amount of discretionary funding that will go to school districts under the local control funding formula, which is a funding mechanism that came into being under former Governor Brown during his second iteration as governor. And so Governor Newsom is proposing $3 billion in discretionary funding under the local control funding formula for school districts to use. Now, you add to that the fact that most of the $30 billion in COVID relief funding for the public schools in California that has come from the federal government and the Biden administration has still yet to be spent. And so you have most of this $30 billion in federal money plus the $3 billion in added discretionary money from under local control funding formula. And you have basically a big pot of money that is basically discretionary money for the districts with little accountability. And that's the problem, I think, so far. Some of the early research that has been done on the money that's been sent down from Washington to the states to see, and we've had research from Georgetown University and some other independent researchers who have looked at where this money has gone. And a lot of times these monies have not gone to where parents and students would have liked them to have gone, certainly taxpayers, because we hear about learning loss amongst students during the COVID pandemic. McKinsey and Company found that students across the country lost 4 to 5 months of learning in math and reading, and yet much of the money that Washington has sent to the states has not been used to make up for those learning losses. They've been spent basically on status quo programs that had proved ineffective in the first place, and also they've been spending it on things such as improvements to athletic facilities and to various other types of non-academic type of programs, which in a perfect world might be a nice thing to have, but when you're faced with students across the country and certainly here in California who have lost so much learning, to have that money not pinpointed and targeted at those students is a travesty, really. And so I think that we're going to be set up for more heartbreak, actually, given this track record.
One thing that the governor addressed briefly, and which lawmakers are also focused on, is a proposal to reform school funding in light of declining enrollment levels. So what are your thoughts on what the legislature is proposing, and also how Governor Newsom is poised to tackle the issue? And what are some of the issues that lawmakers and policymakers should be considering when they're tackling school funding, especially in light of so many more parents and students exercising their school choice options and opting out of traditional public schools?
No, I think that's a really important point, Tim. If you look at what's going on in the legislature, Senator Portantino, who is the chair of the very powerful Appropriations Committee in the Senate, has proposed legislation that would gear funding to enrollment as opposed to what we had been using, average daily attendance. Under average daily attendance, it's basically enrollment minus the attendance rates or minus the absentee rates of students. So that's how you get your funding. So if students are chronically absent, you get less funding. What the Portantino proposes is he proposes to switch to funding just based on enrollment. So, based upon your enrollment figures at the beginning of the year, for example, you get your funding, and it doesn't matter whether the kids actually show up or not. And so what does that do? It gives incentive to the schools to not really pay attention to why those kids have decided not to attend school in the first place, because they're going to get their funding. And so you're going to be missing issues such as giving incentive for the schools to improve their performance, for example. I mean, I just mentioned in my previous answer about reading scores, how California's performance in the core issues like math and reading have been abysmal for years and years. And, that's unsurprising that many children who have to, face failure in the classroom, and these schools end up becoming failure factories, that they don't want to go to school. And so if you fund those failure factories, regardless of whether those kids attend or not, then there's going to be less incentive for those schools to change their programs, to reform their methods so that they address the needs of those kids and improve their performance and their achievement so they want to come back. And so I think that's really one of the big problems with Portantino's proposal. If you look at what the governor's proposing in his budget, he's proposing something that is kind of Portantino light, so to speak. And, he's going to keep the schools basically at a status quo in terms of their funding based upon their enrollment over the last year or 2 or 3 years, depending on various formulas that he's going to use. But basically, it keeps the schools, funding safe, and the fact that they may have declining enrollment for various reasons, whether it's declining population, or if it's the fact that kids have just decided that they don't like going to the public schools, especially in these COVID situations that we've had where schools have been closed, where there are various mandates that parents and the kids don't like, the kids have stayed away. Well, instead of having to take those things into consideration, under both the governor's proposal and also under Portantino's, the schools are going to be kind of held fiscally safe from all of those moves by parents and kids. And again, the bottom line is that prevents those messages of that the parents and the kids are sending by who are exiting the school system from being heard and felt by the people who really need to understand it. Those are the schools and politicians like Portantino and Newsom.
So finally, Lance, the governor discussed another issue that you've written about in recent months, and that's his plan to create a state-run universal pre-K program in California. What are your thoughts on the governor's funding proposal? And will our youngest students really see any benefit from being enrolled in a government universal pre-K program?
Yeah, very good question, Tim. If you look at the governor's proposal, he proposes to expand early childhood programs, whether it's transitional kindergarten programs, state preschool programs, expand them by more than $1 billion. And so, there's a lot of flowery language in his budget's proposal about how we're going to give the tools that young kids need to succeed in school. Well, that's great rhetoric, but is that really true? And if you actually look at the research evidence, especially the recent research evidence that has come out that have analyzed other states' preschool programs, it should really wave a red flag to Californians, especially when they see these optimistic claims by the governor. I mean, for example, Vanderbilt University just did a study recently on the state preschool program in Tennessee, and what they found was that rather than improving the performance of young children, that attendance in the state preschool program actually reduced academic test scores of those kids who participated, increased the likelihood that they would be diagnosed with a learning disability, and increase the amount of discipline problems that these kids who are participating are having, and compared to those who did not participate. And so the researchers at Vanderbilt said that this should be a cautionary tale for not just those policymakers in Tennessee, but all across the country who believe that state preschool is going to be some panacea to these achievement and performance problems that so many states are experiencing.
And for our last round is Carrie Jackson, PRI Fellow in our Center for California Reform and co-author of PRI's most recent study, California Migrating, which documents the causes and the results of Californians leaving the state. And you can find that study on PRI's website, pacificresearch.org. And Carrie's also a prolific blogger on our blog, Right by the Bay, and you can find his op-eds all over California and California publications. So go for it, Tim.
So So, Kerry, Governor Newsom has proposed about $22.5 billion in new climate-related spending over the next 6 years, including funding for more of those electric vehicle subsidies that we've criticized here at PRI over the years. So what are some of the key climate spending proposals that Governor Newsom rolled out in his budget? And in your view, will any of this spending make a difference, or is it really just billions in new pork barrel spending?
Well, there's several gears and sprockets, as you might imagine, on this proposal here on climate. And I'll point out that he listed it as one of 5 existential threats against California. And I don't find this to be an existential threat anywhere, but I guess more on that later, we could say. And one of the things that stuck out to me is he was proposing a climate corps. It's going to be based, I assume, on what they've been talking about in Washington for a climate corps. Again, based on probably Depression-era Rooseveltian programs to pull the country out of its problems, economic problems. I don't see this as being more than some kind of club that's going to gain some people some status. It's going to be an activist organization. I don't imagine it's going to do anything meaningful. And it's like he didn't have a lot of money set aside for it. Isn't planning, but still, I just kind of find this as being something that's just so unnecessary. Of the $22.5 billion, and I'll note that he last year or the current fiscal year, there's a $15.1 billion being spent, or not $15 billion being spent on this same climate change, on these same types of programs. And this year, about $10 billion of it is going to be dedicated to, I think it's going to fall under zero emissions programs. They're going to electrify buses. They're going to retrofit buildings to make them more energy efficient, I assume is what that is. And then of that $10 billion, I believe about 6 is going to go to electric vehicle incentives as well as charging stations. But as I say, I don't see this making any progress anywhere because California, as I pointed out more times than people are probably willing to even listen to at this point, but I think I should keep pointing out, it's only about 1% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. If California fell into the ocean, we know it's not, if it just quit working tomorrow, whatever the case may be, it's not going to have any effect on global temperatures, on climate. Certainly is not as long as China and India continue to build coal plants and they try to pull themselves into first world existence with cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And it's just not going to happen no matter what California does. In fact, it really is not going to happen if the United States shut down all this greenhouse gas emissions. Nothing will be changed because, again, we're looking at the third world trying to make itself the first world. And the way they can do it, really the only way they can do it is through cheap energy, and that's coal primarily. So to answer the question, I know, there's some pork barrel spending in there for sure, but it's just the money's, $22 billion. I don't see it being of any use whatsoever except for political purposes.
So, Kerry, the governor also made a lot of news yesterday with his proposal for expanding eligibility for state-run healthcare programs to all undocumented immigrants living in the state at a cost of over $2 billion annually once it's up and running. And when asked, the governor seemed a bit cool to a single-payer healthcare proposal that's working its way through the legislature this month. So what's your big takeaway from the governor's healthcare budget proposals?
I think in the end, he'll still support a single-payer healthcare for all system. It's by now, it's essentially blue state boilerplate, I think. And didn't he support a single-payer universal system when he was running in 2018? I don't think he's going to back away from that. The current plan is working its way through the legislature. Talked about is got 2 approaches. One is a constitutional amendment that's going to fund the program. The other is a bill that's going to set the regime up, if you will, with the rules, regulations. This is how it's going to work. That may not be the one he eventually supports, but I think he'll end up supporting something. I don't see him turning away from this.
And of course, if you watched his 3-hour-plus budget press conference, you saw the governor took pains to say that he has been a long-standing supporter of single payer, and he's been even supporting it going back a decade.
That kind of makes him a newcomer if it's only a decade. As long as this has been going on, gosh, I mean, we remember in the 70s, and the socialized medicine got the name.
So finally, Kerry, the governor continues to promote one of his greatest hits and something that you've written about many times, and that's high-speed rail. The governor proposed spending the remaining $4.2 billion in Prop 1A bond funds on the project, in addition to billions more for other transit projects. projects. However, last year we saw the legislature really push back for the first time, and they balked at a similar proposal in his 2021-22 budget, and they refused to approve it. So what do you think is the future of high-speed rail budget funding this year and beyond? Will lawmakers ultimately cave into Newsom, or, and more importantly, why do the governor and lawmakers persist in throwing money at a project that now should really be called the little engine that can't?
Yeah, it does seem like that. So I'm start out by answering your last question first about do I think it's they're going to continue to throw money at it. I don't see too many politicians, governor, lawmakers of Sacramento wanting to be the one or the ones that's going to shut down this grand project. And grand, let's put grand in quotation mark. So I think, and I'm not to make a pun here, but this is where this is what I'm thinking at the moment. I think it stays on track. To the scale or size it once was, and I think that's in doubt. And I think maybe the most educated answer I can give about further financing, I wonder if they're going to stop coming to California taxpayers as much as I had in the past, Sacramento in general, going to California taxpayers, and start looking federally and as much as possible. And we got Amtrak Joe in the White House, and the Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is also a big supporter of rail. Let's talk about that. And I think he said something about crisscrossing the country with high-speed rail. I could have remembered that off, but not remember that as accurate as I should. But he's clearly wants this kind of thing to happen. So I think they may be wanting to turn more towards federal money, and I think they're just going to keep trying to throw somebody's money at it. It may not be strictly California money, but they're going to try to get as much federal money as possible. That again, it's an educated guess. Maybe it's an educated answer, but that's what I'm thinking here. And it might have to be scaled down, and that might be something that Newsom would support as when we've seen the thing be scaled down. So I don't see anything in the near future of it going away. Come back to me in 10 years and ask.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.